good evening. Tonight, I can reveal the Albanese government will announce special envoys for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to deal with the disintegration of social cohesion in Australia. It comes as Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong stand accused of presiding over the worst rise in anti-Semitism since World War II. They face criticism, quite rightly, for abandoning Jewish Australians. Yet the Prime Minister can't just appoint an anti-Semitism envoy. He has to pretend there's an Islamophobia crisis as well, even though there's not. And so there's going to be two envoys. The front runner for the anti-Semitism envoy is Gillian Segal, who's a lawyer and a former president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. The idea is the two figures would report to the Prime Minister rather than just the Minister for Multicultural Affairs. This is probably wise given that it's the accident-prone Andrew Giles. Now, an anti-Semitism envoy is something I've personally been campaigning for behind the scenes. I've been raising it with senior Labor figures for 5 months now. There are similar roles in the United States and the UK. Here was the UK government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism, Lord Man of Holbeck, when I interviewed him for Maccabi in October last year. He's brilliant.
We're going to train every teacher in anti-Semitism, all the school teachers. I think that will, over time, make a very big difference. I've been horrified at how little teachers understand of what anti-Semitism is, of even recognising it. If we can't do that, how can we possibly win? It's a failing we failed to do it.
So Lord Mann is a UK Labor politician, not Conservative, and he's not Jewish. He works, as he said there, with school teachers, universities, sporting clubs and political parties as well, in training and educating them about anti-Semitism. Now, here in Australia, I'm told the Albanese government hasn't been able to settle on what they believe is the right person for the job, and that's why they've been taking such a long time in making this announcement. Instead, they've been allowing anti-Semitism to fester. Yet, how long did it take the Albanese government to find a special advisor to oversee Israel's investigation into the death of Australian aid worker Zomi Frankham? 1 weekend. It was just 1 weekend before they announced Air Chief Marshal Binskin would take on that task. It's funny, isn't it, how they can find people to do jobs very quickly when they want to. Well, the anti-Semitism advisor will need to have the courage to really tackle and fight this hatred. And to do that, they need to call out the government itself for the language it uses that, in my opinion, is contributing to the rise of this ancient hatred. And maybe the government could pull back on having backbenchers with no qualifications accusing Israel of war crimes, like Ed Husick did on Sky News on Sunday.
This is a systematic problem or systemic problem within the way in which the Israeli government has conducted these operations in Gaza. And that's why you have seen so many Palestinians killed. And that is an issue that needs to be confronted. And you can tell that the international community has basically determined that Israel has undertaken those failings.
Well, journalist Christopher Daw in The Nightly asked why Ed Husick, Australia's science minister, was commenting on this issue and being allowed to undermine our relationship with Israel. Christopher Daw wrote his only qualification to speak on this topic, apparently, is that he's Muslim. Think about that for a moment. For Labor, is this actually about religion after all? Is this about Israel and Palestine, or is it about Islam and Judaism? Well, in this brilliant piece that I also mentioned last night, Christopher Daw exposes how Ed Husick has gone unchallenged in accusing Israel wrongly of war crimes. He writes Albanese is happy to allow Cabinet Minister Husick to indiscriminately accuse Israel of deliberately targeting and killing thousands of civilians. Outrageous and despicable, divisive, wrong. And you have to ask, why weren't Ed Husic and Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese and the rest of them this angry with Hamas after October 7? Well, Ed Husic isn't the only one accusing Israel of war crimes. Over on the ABC, 7:30 host Sarah Ferguson told a senior Israeli official that she just didn't believe him.
You use the language of tragedy. I want to ask you some questions about whether this reaches to the level of a war crime. Unless you have evidence about the people inside the trucks, was this a war crime? I'm not accepting your view that it's a mistake. There's a lot further to go on this story.
So the ABC host there not accepting his view, Israel's position that this was a mistake, mounting the argument then that this was a war crime. Well, what is her argument? That Israel deliberately killed an aid worker when they've been facilitating nearly 20,000 aid trucks into Gaza in the past 6 months alone. It's absurd. Meanwhile, Penny Wong tonight, and I'm breaking this news now exclusively, is expected to call for a Palestinian state in a speech tonight. That's right. The Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is giving a speech tonight where she's expected to call for a Palestinian state. She's expected to outline her vision for the region, like anyone cares what her vision is. Now, the issue is, and we haven't seen her full remarks yet, I've got this from Labor sources today, but the issue is a Palestinian state is fanciful at the moment. They've squandered billions of dollars in aid, Hamas has, using it for terrorist tunnels and infrastructure. And you can't have a state when it's governed by Hamas, as even Penny Wong is expected tonight to acknowledge. Well, longtime Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz made this point about the calls for a Palestinian state right now when I spoke to him last week.
There has to be a two-state solution, but it can't be created in the wake of Hamas's terrorism and brutality. The structure should be built toward the goal of a two-state solution over time.
So until the international community get off Israel's back as it eliminates Hamas terrorists, until Gaza is free from Hamas, there can be no Palestinian state. For there to be a Palestinian state, the Gazans also need to recognise Israel's right to exist and to stop chanting the genocidal cry from the river to the sea. Or perhaps this chant at protests attended by mainstream political parties like the Greens will be one issue the Albanese government's new anti-Semitism advisor will raise as extremely unhelpful to the flare-up in racism that we're seeing. All right, also tonight, a major change in defence leadership could be just the first in a string of top job shake-ups, what it could mean for our national security in a moment. And 5 days after the latest illegal boat arrival, the minister in charge, well, is she actually in charge? Claire O'Neill finally fronts the media, only to pin blame on others. And Donald Trump's huge call on one of America's most divisive issues and why it's angered some of his conservative supporters. Well, also today, Vice Admiral David Johnston has been tapped as Australia's next Chief of the Defence Force.
He has been in the engine room of all the work that we have done over the last 2 years. And this is a moment where we need a safe pair of hands and deep experience to take our Defence Force forward. And there is no person who meets those qualities better than David Johnston.
All right, let's bring in now Sky News host Steve Price and former Speaker of the House Bronwyn Bishop. Terrific to see you both. Thank you so much for joining me. Steve, look, there's been wide criticism of the current Defence Chief, Angus Campbell, he's been in the role for 6 years. 6 years is a solid amount of time, yet our defence situation is crumbling. We don't have the military infrastructure needed. And meanwhile, he's been accused of presiding over corporate claptrap and a woke culture.
Yeah, you wonder when someone's been in charge for 6 years and Labor does its own review into how the Defence Force is being managed, and that review comes back and says, well, quote, it's not fit for purpose. One would have thought that you might change the head of the Defence Force pretty quickly. There's a couple of intriguing things about this new appointment, and Bronwyn might know a bit more about this than me, but the new Rear Admiral in charge has asked for a 2-year term. I would have thought longevity in one of these jobs, if you're doing the job well, was probably the best thing to have. The other thing that worries me about this new appointment today, one of the first things he said is one of my major roles has to be about culture. I would have thought the major role would have been about recruiting, China, and whether we've got the right equipment to fight a war if we need to, and not worry about culture. It seems like we might be going to get a little more of what we've just had.
I mean, Bronwyn, we're seeing that fewer and fewer people want to join the Australian Defence Force. There has been, I mean, it's not to say that culture's not important, that you don't need, you know, in the past we've seen quite a poor culture, you know, a lot of drinking and other behaviour. So it's not that it's not important, but it's nowhere near as important, as Steve says, as protecting Australia from the most aggressive threat in the form of China that we've faced in years.
Well, Steve's quite right. And when I was the Minister for Defence Industry, I was also in charge of science and personnel. And there was a push then, even all those years ago, to sort of say that the defence can be a social experimental melting pot, if you like. It can push new sorts of social ideas. I wouldn't have a bar of that. I said the purpose of having a defence force is to protect Australia and to fight to do so. And that's its only purpose. So what we've had is it began before General Campbell with this, again, governments accepting that somehow they could be a social laboratory, that they could take on these strange ideas. Well, no, they can't. It has to be a fighting force which knows discipline, it knows what the rules are, it knows what the extremities are, it knows what the boundaries are. And then they can concentrate on doing the job that they're tasked with. So I am appalled when I read a statistic that was in that excellent article by Mr. Dorr, that there have been 20 times more suicide deaths than we've had deaths in the field of battle. That is an horrendous statistic. And that can only come about for a variety of reasons, which we're not going to have time to delve into right at this moment. But that Royal Commission is so important. And if there isn't the lessons learned, that the purpose of the Defence Force is to defend Australia, and it's an honourable profession. It's an honourable thing to do. But when you have a Chief of the Defence Force who doesn't protect your back, when he wants to take away medals, when he is trying to do something that is not in line with what the purpose of the Defence Force is, that's when you get into trouble.
No, exactly. Look, I don't think the media as a whole focused enough on the findings and the evidence that we heard in the Royal Commission into veteran suicide, because there's nothing more horrific than these brave young soldiers who survived war, came back here and were so mistreated that they chose to take their own lives. Now, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil has finally fronted the media today. This is 5 days after the latest illegal boat arrival. As expected, she tried to pin the blame on, you guessed it, Peter Dutton.
I've been a bit disappointed in recent days to see people that I actually respect in the opposition coming out and, you know, telling untruths about this and calling into question aspects of this policy. The Commander of Operation Sovereign Borders has been really open. That provides an alternative narrative for people smugglers, and I ask them to stop doing it.
Steve Price, it's always the coalition's fault when there's a new boat, isn't it? But genuinely, was her response today good enough? Was it adequate?
It was pathetic. It's another train wreck interview. I mean, how she's still got her job and Andrew Giles as well, we say it every week when we catch up. I just can't understand how these ministers have survived. We've had 3 boats got to the actual coastline. People wandering around an Air Force base in remote northwest Western Australia. The latest one, a bunch of blokes from China. And she's saying that it's the opposition's fault that these boats are arriving. Can someone tell Claire O'Neill that prior to her government taking up office in Canberra, winning the election 2 years ago, we had no boats. Now they're in office and they've been there 2 years, the boats are back. Claire O'Neill, that's sending you a message. It's not a message coming from Peter Dutton or James Patterson or anyone on the opposition side. It's just that the people smugglers know inherently that when you're in charge, when Labor's in charge, the opportunity to come by boat starts again. And sure, they're sending them to Nauru, but how does these boats get in, drop these blokes off, the latest one, and the boat disappears? We're not even seeing the commander or whoever's running this operation arrested. I just can't believe she is so delusional.
I mean, there have been concerns that Peter Dutton and other media reports have raised. I think even Olivia Casely here on Sky News actually might have broken the story about an erosion in our aerial surveillance monitoring, which is part of the reason, they say, that boats are actually reaching our shores rather than being detected when they're still at sea. Do you think this... I mean, clearly, Bronwyn, there is something going wrong with the system.
The surveillance operation is pivotal. I've been out on those surveillance operations. When you go out in the surveillance aircraft, you're out there for 8 hours. And what has happened is that the Labor government has cut back the resources to allow them to fly as often. So it's fundamentally important that border surveillance and controls that were put in place by the now opposition were the ones that worked. Now this government has watered it all down. And when we listen to Claire O'Neill or Mr Giles, there's only 2 things you can conclude. A, they're both stupid, or B, they really don't want the policies to work. And I suspect it's the latter. And therefore, when they can't defend themselves, what do they say? Oh, it's got to be somebody else's fault, couldn't possibly be mine. So we get this ridiculous, outlandish criticism of the opposition who are not the government and haven't been now for 2 years. I mean, it is ridiculous.
There is going to be a day when they're going to have to stop blaming the coalition for everything.
People are
Bronwyn, I tell you what we're going to do one week on the show. We're going to give you the names of Chris Bowen, Tony Burke, and get your assessment on every one of those hopeless, hapless ministers. Now, also news today that the Alice Springs youth curfew has been working so well that it's now been extended for another 6 days. So, as you know, this curfew runs from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. All, can we even call them children? Everyone under 18 has to stay indoors for that period. Steve, clearly this was going to work. Do you think, though, that there needs to be... I mean, what is the permanent solution? So it works for another 6 days and then what? It goes back to the situation that it was before?
Well, I saw the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory today make this announcement. When she said the word 6, I was hoping she was going to say 6 months at the very least, or maybe 6 weeks. I might have even been happy. This works. And I can't quite get my head around the fact the curfew lasts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and she said, well, we're going to stop it in 6 days because the children will be back at school. Well, that's in the daytime. I don't know what school's got to do with the curfew at night.
Well, maybe there's after-school activities. Maybe there's after-school activities. I don't know. Swimming, training,
You've got kids
football,
as young as 10 years old running around stealing cars. I mean, seriously, what are they doing up there?
Yeah. Bronwyn, the question is, what is the long-term solution here?
Well, clearly the curfew is working. And I think, like Steve, to say another 6 days is just stupid. Because what you want to get is a pattern for the kids to understand that there are rules and these are the rules that apply. But if you're only going to do it for what? Will it be 3 weeks all in all?
Yes.
That's not nearly long enough. 3 months maybe. And let the pattern become the norm so that when the curfew is over, they'll still behave in that way. That's what you aim for with a curfew.
All right. Bronwyn Bishop, Steve Price, thank you both so much. Great to have you as always. Now, big news today, in fact, a bombshell development in the reopened Bruce Lerman defamation case. Brittany Higgins has raised the question about whether she may have been drugged on the night that she alleges she was raped. Now, this extraordinary question was made in the final submissions, which Brittany Higgins and other parties were invited to do by Justice Michael Lee last week, and it was published by the federal court today. So in her 7-page submission, Brittany Higgins claims that she would have investigated a master chronology, which included an entry from an AFP officer, which brought up the possibility that Higgins could have allegedly been drugged had she been a party to the case. Now, we do not suggest that Ms. Higgins was drugged. This comes as Justice Michael Lee confirmed he is going to deliver his judgment in this case finally on Monday, and we'll bring you all the news right here on Sky. Now, coming up, the solar eclipse, according to Donald Trump. Could this be the most bizarre political ad ever? Adam Crichton will join us live from Washington after a huge 24 hours on the presidential campaign. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, there's been a big question over what Donald Trump's position will be on abortion ahead of the presidential election. This contentious issue divides Americans in a major way. Well, Trump has finally come clear with his position, which is that he won't exactly have one. Trump has released a 4-minute video where he said abortion policy should be left up to individual states. Have a look.
I was proudly the person responsible for the ending of something that all legal scholars, both sides, wanted and, in fact, demanded be ended. Roe v. Wade. The states will determine by vote or legislation or perhaps both, and whatever they decide must be the law of the land, in this case, the law of the state.
All right, let's bring in now the Australian's Washington correspondent, Adam Crichton. Adam, so good to see you as always. Look, Trump has previously said that abortion should be banned from 15 weeks. He hasn't been so clear then, but he does seem to take credit for that decision by the Supreme Court. Very controversial move, obviously, to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yes. Well, certainly Donald Trump has had a lot of positions on abortion over the years. I mean, of course, he was a Democrat in the early 2000s, remember? So, look, I don't think he probably has strong personal feelings, but I think he's really done the smart thing here politically. He wants to talk about the southern border. He wants to talk about the economy. He does not want to talk about the extremely divisive issue of abortion in this election. And, of course, if he had have said that he was going to have a policy, then that gives the Democrats a huge scare campaign to work with. So a smart move, I think. Actually, also, one really interesting fact I found out too today, the number of abortions since the Dobbs decision has not gone down. It's actually gone up in the US. So there you go.
Look, I mean, part of his reason for taking the position that he has, or non-position, is obviously that he doesn't want to lose swinging voters or even Democrats who don't want to support Biden again, given his cognitive issues. But the fact that he didn't support a national abortion ban, or even an abortion ban from a certain number of weeks, is this going to get some Conservatives offside?
Yes, look, it probably will. And so we saw this afternoon that Mike Pence came out and, and slammed his former boss because Mike Pence supports a 6-week ban, which is not very popular in the US. But yeah, sure, some of the evangelicals will be angry, but, they're not going to vote for Biden because if Biden gets back in, then, of course, they're seeking to legislate abortion to the second trimester, I think. So much worse with the Democrats.
So interesting, because it's just not a political issue here at all. Now, in a blow to Donald Trump...
Yes, it's so different.
Yeah, a New York appeals court has dismissed his latest attempt to try and delay this hush money criminal trial. It's scheduled, I think, for April the 15th. Adam, so this is the first of Trump's 4 indictments. Where do you think all of these are heading? Or are we just going to see him go from court case to court case over the next few months?
Well, look, I think that this trial coming up, which does start next week, this is the hush money case, that's probably going to be the only trial that actually goes to trial before the election, because there have been a series of useful decisions by the Supreme Court and by others that have pushed the other cases into the future. So it's all been very good news, really, for Donald Trump. And indeed, the only case that is actually going to go to trial is the most ridiculous one, you'd probably say, the one that very few Americans have respect for. So this is the one that helps Trump the most politically. So, you know, he's probably quite happy that that's the one that's going to trial.
Now, let's have a look at his ad that everyone's talking about. I mean, the solar eclipse has obviously been a major event. And here's what Donald Trump did with an advert. Knows how to insert himself into a news story. But Adam, Joe Biden took the opportunity to criticise Trump, and he referenced a 2017 photograph where Trump was looking up at the sun without glasses. Biden posted on social media. Let's have a look.
Folks, enjoy the eclipse, but play it safe. Don't be silly.
Look, that was a bit of a silly response from Biden. Adam?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think they're both just having a bit of fun at each other. You know, I mean, I think Americans like that. I mean, in terms of Trump's ads, I mean, he's getting funnier and funnier. I mean, I've had a few Americans only recently have said, you know, it was so funny under President Trump. And so I think you can't write off the appeal of his humour, actually, to voters.
Now, a new poll shows confidence in Biden is crashing, with only 39% of Americans saying the 81-year-old can manage the government effectively. 48% believe he cares about people like them. 46% think he's honest and trustworthy. I'm surprised it's also high. Adam, this is, look, a huge hit to Biden's campaign. What are the more broader polls showing about how Trump and Biden would fare come November?
Yeah, well, all the polls are basically saying the same thing, and that is that Trump is ahead in pretty much all of the states that matter, certainly in the marginal states, the swing states, I should say. The betting markets say the same thing. The most likely winner of the election is Donald Trump. So both of those markets are pointing to a Trump victory, but it's still, you know, seven months away. Many things can happen. And you know, probably the vast bulk of American voters still aren't really paying attention yet, I would say.
I mean, we've spoken about this before, but do you still think that Biden is going to be the Democratic candidate, or do you think there's still a good chance that they try and choose someone else and do a handover at the convention?
Well, look, I thought that 6 months ago, but I'm thinking it less and less now because, of course, the convention is getting closer. It's in August in Chicago, and, you know, Biden seems relatively sprightly recently. I mean, I think even his speaking ability has improved, I think, in recent months. So he seems very determined. So I'd have to say 50-50 now.
Yeah, all right. We'll keep in touch. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Now, as we mentioned, Vice Admiral David Johnston has been named as the country's next chief of the Defence Force. But Johnston avoided some tough questions during his address today.
China, what sort of challenge or threat does it pose to Australia? And secondly, do you support stripping medals and decorations from soldiers involved in the war crimes investigation?
I think the government's view on our international security will become clear when the National Defence Strategy announcements are made, so I will leave that for that opportunity, and I'll also leave the second question. Thanks.
There were also reports in the Fin Review today that the top jobs at AFP, ASIO, the ASD, that's the Signals Directorate, and Border Force are all going to become vacant, most likely in the next few months. We've been reporting on this here on this show as well. Let's bring in now Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Michael, great to see you. Look, let's start with this new Defence Chief appointment. It's a major role. Is Johnston the man that Australia needs right now at a time of increasing volatility in our region?
Well, Sharri, unfortunately, I don't think so. He is the continuity candidate. So if you think that Australia's defence organisation has been going in the right direction and moving to address critical problems like its recruitment crisis or the fact we don't have a Navy ship we can send to the Red Sea, then he's a good choice. But if you think the last 6 years have been a time of drift, inaction and missed opportunity, then the continuity candidate, who's been the vice chief for this time, looks a bad choice.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Look, we've discussed, I think even you and I before, how the ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, also Andrew Shearer, who heads the entire intelligence community here in Australia, both those roles are going to come up in the next year or so. The Fin Review also reporting that the top jobs at the AFP, the ASD and Border Force are going to fall vacant. How worried are you that it's going to be Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong and others like them who are going to be the ones, this Labor government, choosing the replacements for these critical positions when we know already that they've diverted the attention of people like Andrew Shearer to do a climate change review instead of just worrying about terrorism?
Well, Sharri, my main concern is the silencing of any critical voice or advice to ministers, so that a pushing back of the ASIO and ASIS chiefs from the National Security Committee, hearing Admiral Johnston today say he'll leave answering questions to the government and to future times, this silencing of senior serious voices really worries me. For example, when's the last time you heard a defence official, or indeed any senior official, talk critically about China? They've been muzzled by the ministers.
That's such a good point. They're not speaking critically about China, all but silent. It's a very occasional rebuke. And yet we hear criticism every day about our supposed ally, Israel.
Well, yes. So it took visiting UK ministers a couple of weeks ago to tell us the reason we're getting nuclear submarines is we want to deter China from starting a war. And this is the kind of problem. If you cannot have a serious public discussion because you can't name your security problems, how can we expect officials to address them?
Yeah, exactly. Right, Michael Shoebridge, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights as always. Now, coming up out of prison and straight onto the NDIS, the shocking new revelations on where the scheme's billions, or some of them, are being spent. And new data confirming what millions of Australians already know: the spiralling cost of living is our #1 concern. Welcome back. Well, I exclusively revealed earlier in the show that Foreign Minister Penny Wong was expected tonight to call for recognition of a Palestinian state. Well, she has now done that. And the rest of the media are now reporting what I told you some half an hour ago. So Penny Wong has said, and I'll read you the quotes. She says the international community is now considering the question of Palestinian statehood as a way of building momentum towards a two-state solution. She says the simple truth is that a secure and prosperous future for both Israelis and Palestinians will only come with a two-state solution, recognition of each other's right to exist. She says that if there is international recognition of a Palestinian state, that it will put pressure on Israel and the Palestinians to then do the same. So Foreign Minister Penny Wong, 6 months after the most brutal terror attacks on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, is now, when Hamas, by the way, is still in control of Gaza, Hamas, the terrorist organisation, is now urging the community to recognise a Palestinian state. Now, let's bring in tonight's Political Insiders panel, Liberal Senator Holly Hughes and Menzies Research Centre Senior Fellow Nick Cater. Now, Holly, most people support a two-state solution. I certainly do. But obviously not when Hamas is in control. Absolutely not. And this shouldn't be Penny Wong's demand right now in the middle of a war against terrorists, while there are still 134 civilians being held, God knows where, in dark, God-forsaken tunnels by terrorists, including babies and children.
I'm not quite sure where the Labor Party get off deciding that they're going to be the purveyors of what foreign policy should be for the rest of the world and what's saying that Israel should do. The fact that she's saying that Palestine has a right to exist, well, perhaps there's a few Palestinians that need to accept that Israel very much has a right to exist. And we know that Hamas does not believe that. We know that the kids in school that taught by UNRWA are taught not to believe that. So I actually find this really quite disgraceful, and to do so, as you say, while there are over 130 hostages still being held by Hamas, those families don't know whether they are alive or dead. It is absolutely appalling, and this Labor government has just shown such contempt for, and I don't want to say the Australian Jewish community, because I've spoken to the Australian Jewish community and they just want to be the Jewish community within Australia. They don't like having it as a separate part because they feel that they're Australians just the same as everyone else. But yet they are being pushed to one side by a government that is balancing its own left wing and appeasing a couple of seats in Western Sydney. It's disgusting.
I don't even think it's just about the politics. I think this is Anthony Albanese's long-held position.
I think it's a lot of their long-held position.
Yes, that he's always been anti-Israel, and we know that because of the comments that he said in Parliament over the past 20 years that I've played on the show. But what I also can't cop is how Penny Wong just criticises Netanyahu again and again and again. Very controversial politician. A lot of people don't like him. Fine. But the issue is right now, the obstacle to peace is not Netanyahu. The obstacle to peace, Nick Hater, is Hamas. And as Holly Hughes said just now, as I said at the start of the show earlier tonight, it's not the case that Israelis don't want a two-state solution. It's the case that the Palestinian activists, even here in Australia, are chanting from the river to the sea. It's the case that those who are governing Gaza, Hamas, don't want Israel to even exist. That's why this is an existential war for Israel.
Sharri, I've done a lot of these crosses with Sky News, but I think this is the first time I've generally felt lost for words. The news you've just broken to me that Penny Wong says we need to recognise Palestine as the first step towards a two-state solution. What two-state solution? All of us, of course, hoped there would be a two-state solution. We've been hoping against the evidence for the last 20 years, but any hope for a two-state solution died on October the 7th last year. You cannot have a two-state solution unless you've got partners for peace who are prepared to go through the difficult negotiations that would come to establishing two states. And let's not forget, Sharri, that when we talk about Palestine as a state, that's an entirely novel concept. Palestine has never been a state. The Palestinians have never had their own state. Now, if they want statehood, they have to earn it by being respectful of their neighbours, being respectful of their own citizens, and for them to, of course, to declare that they want to see Israel struck off the map. What chance of a two-state solution then? I mean, how can you have a two-state solution when one side says wipe the other off the map? I think I'd like to say this is just naivety on Penny Wong's part, but I really can't believe that she is that naive. This is a terrible, terrible development in Australian foreign policy.
No, she's not naive. She's a foreign policy dud, the worst foreign policy minister we've probably ever had. Now, let's have a look at this story that was on the front page of the Australian newspaper today. Serial sex offender Wayne Wilmot, who played a role in the horrific abduction, rape and murder of Janine Boulding in the 80s, has now scored NDIS support for his release back into the community. So according to the report in The Australian, Wilmot will receive 8 hours of help each week with daily life and 16 hours of weekly assistance with economic and community participation. Journalist Christine Middap reports that it's unclear how NDIS support workers will be protected, and the case will only add to pressure on the Albanese government over violent criminals accessing the disability scheme. Now, Holly, you know a lot about the NDIS. I mean, what's happening here? How can this be allowed?
This is just absolutely outrageous, and it is so in the face of what the NDIS is there for. The NDIS was designed and should be for people with permanent and lifelong disability. This guy doesn't have either. This guy is, they've said in the article, psychopathic tendencies. That is not permanent lifelong disability. It is absolutely disgraceful. It is part of what the states are doing, pushing everything onto the NDIS, whether it's education, mental health, early childhood support, allied health support. But now what they are doing with the criminal justice system is disgraceful, but it is dangerous. And the point that was made by the journalist, who is going to protect the workers, when it's quite sickening to read. This guy's been released before, within 8 months of freedom, committed 4 serious sexual assaults on women. He has a view that women are fair game for this sort of violence and sexual assault. And for those of us that are in the disability community, this is horrifying because it stains everybody. And this is absolutely not allowed to occur. If Bill Shorten does not put his foot down here and say that this must stop, this lies at his doorstep. He has said that he is bringing the states back to the table. Well, if there has ever been a better example of where he needs to bring them back to the table, they need to take responsibility for their own criminal justice system. The fact that this guy's being let out at all is horrifying to my mind. But this is not what the NDIS was designed for. This is not the type of person that should be receiving it at all. And I think with someone with this sort of history, they should be excluded from things that are there for the betterment of society, not for someone who thinks women are fair game when it comes to sexual assault.
Nick Cater, there are a lot of families, you would speak to them, we all do, you hear them on Talkback Radio, who can't access NDIS funds and they're in genuine need for their children or a family member. And then you hear about cases like this.
Yeah, I mean, look, if this guy is safe to be let back in the community, and that's an enormous if, I have to say, he needs help, Sharri, but this is not the help he needs. And he doesn't need welfare. He needs strict monitoring and careful rehabilitation in the community. That's not what NDIS does. But you make the very good point, of course, that you hand out NDIS to a character like this. It's one person who probably needs help, who has a genuine identifiable disability, who's not going to get it. And that's the problem with the NDIS system. It just rewards those with the best providers who can, make the most outrageous claims. And I say this as somebody who's been closely involved with the NDIS on behalf of 2 relatives. I see this close up. I mean, it's not that the NDIS doesn't provide some help to some people, but there is a massive, massive misallocation of government funds going on.
A big mess,
and people who don't need it.
A big mess, and it's the greatest burden on the budget as well. Now, very quickly before we go, New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has now ordered a review into termination payments given to senior public servants, and that was his reaction after revelations that taxpayers had to foot the bill for nearly $700,000 for 3 spin doctors that the Police Commissioner, Karen Webb, hired and fired over the past 2 years. Look, the Premier's still sticking by the Police Commissioner. I suppose, it does take a lot to actually sack a Police Commissioner, but you wouldn't say she's doing a great job.
Well, certainly her spin doctors aren't doing a great job if we look at their current employment record. But I think this is indicative. When you look at the size of these payouts, the public service is now paid at such a rate. Now, I say this as a Member of Parliament. The Prime Minister wouldn't be getting as much money as some of these spin doctors that are being employed. That's why their payments are so big when they're being let go, because the salaries in the public service are enormous. I mean, when you're talking about ministers are paid less than their, corporate spin doctor in the department, or, in some instances, half of what the secretary of their department's earning, something is out of kilter.
No, I completely agree. Just very quickly, 20 seconds, Nick, what's your view?
Well, I was hoping you'd find some good news to end the segment with, Sharri, and I think you almost have. I mean, it's great. Let's give Chris Minns credit. He is bringing public servants to account and saying, well, if you want that money you have to earn it. That doesn't happen too often in state or federal politics right now. So let's give Chris Minns a round of applause for that.
As I've said before, he's the best Labor leader in the country right now. Nick Cater, Holly Hughes, thank you so much. Now, after the break, reaction to that breaking news, I'll be speaking to an Israeli MP live. Stay tuned. Well, returning to that breaking news that Foreign Minister Penny Wong has tonight called for a Palestinian state, saying that it is the key to peace in the Middle East. Here she is.
So the international community is now considering the question of Palestinian statehood as a way of building momentum towards a two-state solution. Because the simple truth is that a secure and prosperous future for both Israelis and Palestinians will only come with a two-state solution. Recognition of each other's right to exist.
All right, let's bring in now Israeli politician Sharon Haskell, joining me live from Israel. Sharon, thank you for your time. What is your reaction to this? Australia's foreign minister saying the only way to achieve peace in the Middle East is for international recognition of a Palestinian state.
Well, I'm actually quite shocked. Matter of fact, this is coming only from a lack of understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a lack of understanding of what is actually happening in the Middle East. Israel is fighting radical Islam, and a declaration like that is actually rewarding terrorism. It's rewarding Hamas. More so, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not based on a territorial conflict, but a cultural and a religious conflict. And time after time, we tried a territorial solution. Gaza was the two-state solution experiment that has completely failed and blown up in our faces. They had the autonomy to build their own autonomy and infrastructures and an education system and an economy. But instead, they decided to invest in war, in weapons, in violence, and hatred towards Israel. So the 7th of October was the actual explosion of the idea that a two-state solution is something that is actually possible, and especially possible at this particular moment as well. And when Penny Wong comes and says that this is the solution, this is a complete lack of understanding of what this conflict is about and the arena of the Middle East at this current time.
Sharon, the Australian government, Penny Wong again, has appointed a special advisor to oversee Israel's investigation into the IDF soldiers involved in the tragic killing of the aid workers last week. I know you don't know whether Israel is going to allow this access, but what do you think about this unprecedented move?
Well, I think this is not how you act in between friends. Look, there's a long-lasting connection and friendship between Israel and Australia. And there's a lot of cooperation on the security and intelligence basis, a very strong and good cooperation, because we are all fighting together against radical Islam. And the foreign minister knows that. Penny Wong knows that. Now, we work in close cooperation with the states as well. Yeah. When we have an investigation, we're not trying to run away from responsibility.
Sharon, okay? I apologise for interrupting you. I apologise for interrupting you. We're completely out of time, but very strong remarks. Thank you for coming on the show. That's all we've got time for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 8, and here's Paul.